I spend my summers in a small, quiet village called Violet Vale. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, or at least they think they do. My family's cottage is nestled at the edge of the woods, with a small garden and a creaky wooden porch where I spend most evenings reading or staring up at the stars. Life in Violet Vale is peaceful, for the most part, except for one unsettling neighbor, Eliza Chandler. Eliza's house is next door, separated by a sagging fence and a narrow dirt path. She's a peculiar woman, gray-haired and frail, always sitting on a bench outside her house. She mumbles under her breath from morning until night, never looking up unless something or someone disturbs her rhythm. Most people steer clear of her, whispering about her troubled past, though no one ever tells you exactly what happened. I thought she was harmless until the summer I turned 18. That was when I started to notice strange things. One lazy afternoon, I was walking back from the village market with a bag of fresh bread and vegetables. Eliza was on her bench, as usual, her thin hands hovering over her lap as if she were cradling something. From a distance, it looked like a cat, a small, scruffy thing she was petting with slow, deliberate strokes. But as I got closer, I realized there was no cat. Her hands moved through the empty air, stroking something invisible. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowed my pace. She didn't seem to notice me, her gaze fixed on her hands as she murmured softly. I strained to catch the words. "It's in there. Don't be naughty now. Stay where you belong." A chill ran down my spine. I hurried past her, keeping my eyes on the road ahead. That night, I couldn't shake the image of her empty lap, her hands moving as if guided by some unseen force. The real horror began a week later. It was late at night, and I was alone in my room at the cottage. The air was still and heavy, the kind of summer night that makes sleep elusive. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke suddenly to the feeling of something brushing against my arm. Groggy, I reached out instinctively and touched something furry. My first thought was that it was Oreo, my cat, until I remembered Oreo was back in the city with my parents. My eyes snapped open, and my hand froze. Whatever I was touching wasn't soft and familiar. Its fur was coarse, almost bristly, and it shifted under my touch. Panic gripped me as I slowly turned my head. Before I could see it clearly, the thing leapt off the bed with an unnatural, jerking motion. It darted toward the door, a blur of shadow and fur. My heart raced as I sat up, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The door to my room was slightly ajar. I told myself it must have been a stray cat, though something about its movement felt wrong. I tried to calm my breathing, but as I turned toward the window, I saw her. Eliza. She was standing just outside, her face pressed close to the glass. Her gray hair hung loose around her face, and her eyes were wide, unblinking. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she smiled, a slow, unsettling curl of her lips. Before I could react, she turned and ran. But it wasn't a normal run. Her body moved in jerky, unnatural bursts, as if she were being yanked along by invisible strings. She disappeared into the shadows of her yard, and I was left staring at the empty space where she had been. The next morning, I decided to confront her. Part of me hoped it had all been a bad dream, but when I passed by her house, she was sitting on her bench, as serene as ever. Her hair was neatly combed, and she was mumbling to herself, stroking the air above her lap. I approached cautiously. "Mrs. Chandler?" I called out. She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the invisible creature in her lap. "Mrs. Chandler." I tried again, louder this time. "Did you come by my house last night?" Her hands froze mid-stroke, and she turned her head slowly to look at me. For a moment, her expression was blank. Then a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "You saw him, didn't you?" she whispered. "Saw who?" I asked, though my throat felt tight. Her lips curled into that unsettling smile. "You should have stayed asleep, boy. He doesn't like being seen." I backed away, feeling the weight of her gaze follow me. Over the next few days, I tried to put the encounter out of my mind, but it was impossible. At night, I would hear strange noises outside my window. Scratching, faint whispers, the sound of something dragging across the ground. I started locking my door and keeping the curtains drawn, but the feeling of being watched never went away. One evening, I decided to ask around about Eliza. At the village store, I struck up a conversation with Mr. Hargrove, an older man who had lived in Violet Vale his whole life. When I mentioned Eliza, his face darkened. "She's not right in the head," he said. "Lost her husband years ago, in a bad way. Folks say she's been talking to his spirit ever since." "What happened to him?" I pressed. Mr. Hargrove hesitated, then lowered his voice. "They found him on her bench, sitting right where she sits now. Heart attack, they said, but the look on his face, like he'd seen the devil himself." That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard a faint tapping on my window. My heart raced as I crept toward it, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. There she was, standing in the moonlight with that same eerie smile. But this time, she wasn't alone. At her feet was the thing from my room, a shadowy, fur-covered creature with glowing eyes. It wasn't quite a cat, nor a dog. Its limbs were too long, its movements too unnatural. "Leave him alone," I heard her say, her voice soft but firm. The creature hissed, then slithered away into the darkness. She looked up at my window, her expression almost apologetic. Then she turned and shuffled back to her bench. The next morning, I packed my bags and left Violet Vale. I haven't been back since, but sometimes, late at night, I think I hear scratching at my door. And in my dreams, I see Eliza sitting on her bench, stroking something that isn't there, mumbling softly to the shadows. I left Violet Vale that summer and tried to bury the memory of Eliza Chandler and her strange pet, or whatever that thing was. Life in the city was easier to manage. Here, shadows didn't feel alive, and there were no whispers in the dark. But the unease lingered like an itch I couldn't scratch. At night, I'd wake suddenly, convinced I heard faint scratching at my bedroom door. Sometimes I thought I saw shadows flit across the room, though when I turned on the light, there was nothing there. My friends noticed my restlessness, but how could I explain what had happened without sounding insane? Months later, in late October, I received a call from my cousin, Elsie. She was the only other family member who knew about the strange things I'd experienced in Violet Vale. She'd grown up there too, though her family had moved away years ago. When I heard her voice on the line, it was strained, her words rushing out like water through a broken dam. "Zach, it's about Eliza," she said, skipping any pleasantries. "You're not going to believe this." "What about her?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "She's gone. Disappeared. No one's seen her for weeks." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "What do you mean, gone?" "The neighbors say her bench is empty, the house locked up tight. But here's the weird part. People have been hearing things." My chest tightened. "What kind of things?" Elsie lowered her voice, though we were miles apart. "Scratching, whispers, and a few of them said they've seen something darting through the woods at night, like a shadow with glowing eyes." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to think about what this meant, but my mind immediately returned to that thing in my room. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Because I think it's connected to you. You were the last person to see her, before she started acting strange." "Started acting strange?" I echoed. "Elsie, she's always been strange." "You know what I mean," she snapped. "Something changed that summer, didn't it? You saw something, didn't you?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "Yeah, I saw something." Against my better judgment, I agreed to return to Violet Vale with Elsie. She wanted answers, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow tied to whatever was happening. When we arrived, the village felt different. It was quieter than I remembered, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. We stopped by Eliza's property first. Her bench was still there, empty and weathered, but the house looked darker somehow, as if it had absorbed the shadows around it. Elsie and I stood at the gate, neither of us eager to step onto the property. "What do you think happened to her?" Elsie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think we should start by looking around." Reluctantly, we crossed the threshold. The grass was overgrown, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and earth. The closer we got to the house, the more oppressive the atmosphere felt, as if the weight of Eliza's presence still lingered. We tried the front door, but it was locked. Elsie suggested checking the windows, so we split up, each taking a side of the house. As I rounded the corner, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. My heart leapt, but when I turned, there was nothing there, just the sway of the tall grass in the breeze. Inside the house, everything was exactly as I remembered it. Sparse, neat, and eerily quiet. The furniture was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if Eliza had been gone for far longer than a few weeks. On the mantel above the fireplace, I noticed a row of framed photographs. Most were faded, the faces unrecognizable, but one caught my eye. It was a black and white picture of Eliza, much younger, sitting on the same bench outside her house. Her hands were folded in her lap, but unlike the other photos, this one seemed off. The shadows around her looked too deep, and her eyes, even in the faded print, seemed too bright. "Zach," Elsie called from the kitchen. "You need to see this." I found her standing in front of an old cabinet, its door hanging open. Inside were dozens of jars, each filled with a murky liquid. Floating in the liquid were tufts of fur, small bones, and other unidentifiable objects. "What is this?" Elsie asked, her face pale. I shook my head, unable to form an answer. The jars gave off a faint, acrid smell that made my stomach turn. Then we heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from upstairs. Neither of us wanted to investigate, but we couldn't ignore it either. Slowly, we climbed the stairs, each creak of the old wood sending shivers down my spine. The scratching grew louder as we approached the end of the hallway, where a door stood slightly ajar. "Do we really want to do this?" Elsie whispered. I swallowed hard. Yes. Pushing the door open, we found ourselves in a small, empty rail. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with strange trinkets, cracked mirrors, yellowed pages of books, and more jars like the ones in the kitchen. In the center of the room was a wooden chair, its seat worn and splintered. The scratching sound stopped abruptly, and the silence was deafening. "I don't like this," Elsie said, taking a step back. Just as I turned to agree, the air grew cold, and a faint whisper filled the room. It was Eliza's voice, low and raspy. "Why did you come back?" We bolted out of the house, not stopping until we were back on the road. My heart was pounding, and my mind raced with questions. Or what was Eliza really? And what had I brought upon myself by returning to Violet Vale? That night, we stayed at the Village Inn. I couldn't sleep, my thoughts consumed by the day's events. Around midnight, I heard the familiar sound of scratching at the window. Dread settled over me as I turned to look. There, just beyond the glass, were two glowing eyes. "Leave him alone," a voice whispered, though I couldn't tell if it was Eliza's or something else entirely. The eyes vanished, and the room fell silent once more. The next morning, Elsie and I packed our things and left Violet Vale for good. Neither of us spoke much on the drive back, but I could tell she was just as shaken as I was. Weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was spidery and uneven, just like Eliza's. Inside was a single photograph, me, standing outside her house, with those glowing eyes staring at me from the shadows. I burned the letter and the photo, but the feeling of being watched has never left me. I don't know what Eliza unleashed that summer, but I do know one thing. Some shadows aren't meant to be disturbed. And in Violet Vale, they have a way of finding their way back to you.